I'm not here to own you. But before hearing those words, Clara, a woman over 50 years old, was considered a debt by her family, forced to marry like a commodity. After years of humiliation and coldness, did she ever wonder, am I still worthy of being loved? And then in the middle of the dusty West, when a rancher quietly looked at her and uttered those words, could that be the beginning of a different life, where Clara is no longer a burden, but is chosen, respected, and truly loved? The wind of late autumn carried with it the smell of dust and cattle, the kind that clung to skin and clothes as if it meant to remind you of where you belonged. Clara stepped down from the creaking wagon, her boots sinking slightly into the dry earth of the Dakota Territory. She carried no trunk of treasures, only a small leather satchel with a change of clothes, a worn Bible, and the letter that had sealed her fate. Her family had sent her here, not with blessings or encouragement, but with quiet relief, as though shipping her west erased their burden. At 50, Clara was not young enough to bring pride, not wealthy enough to be of use, not thin or lively enough to win suitors. Instead, she was packaged into a mail-order bride contract her passage paid her, worth reduced to ink and expectation. She had not argued. After years of being dismissed, mocked for her silence, and forced into corners where no voice was welcome, Clara had learned how to endure. She had carried younger siblings when her parents faltered, fed mouths that never once thanked her, and swallowed bitterness in place of rebellion. To argue now would have been like throwing a stone into the sea; it would vanish unheard. When she reached the ranch, she expected the usual, a man who looked at her with ownership in his eyes, weighing her as one might weigh cattle or land. She braced herself, shoulders, squared heart already folded small. But Thomas Boone, the rancher she had been promised to, did not look at her that way. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with hair touched by gray and eyes shadowed by loss. A widower, she had heard, a man hardened by the land. She prepared herself for bluntness, maybe cruelty. Instead, when she handed him the letter, he read it once and let it fall to his side. Silence stretched between them, the prairie winds humming through the grass. Clara waited, heat burning her cheeks. At last he spoke, his voice low, steady, not unkind. I'm not here to own you. His words had cracked open a door she thought was forever locked. But were they only words of courtesy, or the beginning of something she had never known respect? The words struck her harder than ridicule ever had. She blinked, unsure if she'd heard right. He didn't repeat himself. Instead, he turned and gestured toward the house, a modest dwelling of timber and stone, as though inviting her not as a possession, but as a guest. For the first time in years, Clara felt a sliver of air move through her chest. It wasn't freedom yet, not trust, but it was something different. And different was enough to make her wonder. That night, lying on a narrow bed in a room that smelled faintly of cedar and dust, Clara pressed her hand to her heart. Not here to own you. The words circled in her mind, fragile as glass, daring her to believe. But hope was dangerous, and Clara knew better than to trust too soon. The following morning, Clara rose before the sun. Old habits had carved themselves deep into her body, years of rising early to cook, clean, and serve others. She moved quietly through the small kitchen fingers, brushing over the shelves lined with jars of beans and flour, noting how little there was. She set a pot of water to boil, though she had not been told to. When Thomas entered, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, he stopped short at the sight of her. For a moment, neither spoke. He was not a man accustomed to finding someone else tending his hearth. His late wife had been gone for years, and silence had been his only companion. "You don't have to," he said gruffly, nodding toward the pot. Clara's hand stilled on the wooden spoon. "I know," she replied softly, "but I need to." Thomas studied her, the faint morning light catching on the lines of her face. Something stirred in him, a flicker of memory he hadn't expected. "Have we met before?" he asked, surprising even himself. Clara froze, her breath catching. She hadn't thought he would remember. But yes, they had crossed paths once many years ago. "It was the winter of '83, she said carefully, her voice almost a whisper. "The blizzard came sudden. You were thrown from your horse." Thomas blinked, the memory piecing itself together. He recalled stumbling through the snow, half-conscious, until a woman's voice guided him to shelter. A fire had been lit, broth pressed into his hands, warmth returning to frozen bones. He had never even asked her name. He had been too broken, too proud, and when he woke fully, she was gone. "That was you," he murmured, more statement than question. Clara nodded, her cheeks flushing. "I only did what anyone would have done." But Thomas shook his head slowly. "Not anyone. Folks don't always stop for a stranger. Not in a storm like that." For the first time, his gaze softened, no longer guarded. He looked at her not as a burden sent by contract, but as a woman whose kindness had once saved him. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was warm, like a quilt pulled close on a cold night. Clara found herself exhaling the tension in her shoulders, easing ever so slightly. That day they worked side by side. Clara cleaned what she could, mended a torn curtain, and kneaded bread with hands that had long learned the rhythm of survival. Thomas spent the hours repairing a fence line, but each time he passed the window he caught sight of her steady patient, quietly present. When the bread came out of the oven, she set a small piece aside. Without a word, she placed it on the table before him, the crust golden, the scent filling the kitchen. Thomas sat down, tasted it, and for the first time in years let a small smile touch his lips. It wasn't much, but it was the beginning of something. That night Clara lay awake, listening to the wind brush against the house. She thought of the man in the next room, stoic, scarred, and yet unexpectedly gentle. And she thought of the strange turn of fate that had brought them together once more. Perhaps it wasn't only a contract that had tied their paths. Perhaps something greater had been weaving their lives together all along. A chance meeting from years ago had become the thread that bound them now. But would it be strong enough to withstand the weight of gossip, duty, and old wounds yet to surface? The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm neither Clara nor Thomas had expected. She cooked simple meals, tended to the hens, and kept the hearth alive with quiet diligence. He repaired fences, split logs, and drove cattle through the pastures, with the measured strength of a man who had long lived in silence. And yet beneath this fragile order, tension grew. It wasn't between them, not truly. It was the town. Word travels faster than horses in a place like Dry Creek. And word about Thomas Boone, the stoic widower, taking in a mail-order bride, nearly 20 years his junior or older, depending on whose gossip you believed, well, it lit fires in every saloon and store. "They say she's too old for him," one woman sneered as Clara passed the mercantile shelves. "Too plain," another added, whispering behind a hand. Her family didn't want her. Why would he, a man muttered loud enough to hear? Clara kept her chin lifted, but her hands shook when she folded the sack of flour against her chest. Every word reminded her of what she had always feared, that she was a burden handed off, not a woman worthy of choosing. Thomas noticed. That evening, when she was kneading dough with more force than necessary, he spoke. "You're not here to take their approval," he said firmly. Clara's hands stilled. "Then why am I here, Thomas? My family didn't send me for kindness. They sent me to be someone's duty, someone's weight to carry." His gaze softened, shadows of memory passing through his eyes. "I told you the day you arrived, I'm not here to own you." Her breath caught, anger and sorrow mixing. "Then what am I to you, a cook, a shadow filling your house, or just a reminder of a promise you never made?" The room grew quiet, only the crackle of the fire filling the air. Thomas stepped closer, his voice low. "You're the woman who once saved me in a storm. You're the woman strong enough to stand here when the world tried to strip you down to nothing. I don't need ownership, Clara. I need someone who stays." She turned away, tears threatening. Someone who stays. How many times had she stayed before, through her father's harsh words, through her siblings' ungrateful demands, through years of being unwanted? Staying had always meant losing pieces of herself. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that this was different. But scars don't fade so easily. That night alone in her narrow bed, Clara pressed her hand to her chest. She could still hear the whispers, the doubts, the mocking laughter that clung to her even now. And yet beneath it all, Thomas's words lingered steady as the rhythm of a heartbeat. "I need someone who stays." But staying had always been her prison. Could it ever become her freedom? Clara longed to believe she was more than a burden, more than a shadow left by her family's shame. But the weight of the past still chained her heart. Would Thomas's quiet respect be enough to break through? The breaking point came on a Sunday afternoon. Clara had gone into town with Thomas for supplies. The streets were muddy from last night's rain, and the air carried the smell of damp wood and horse sweat. She walked a few steps behind him, basket in hand, when a group of ranch hands lounging near the saloon burst into laughter. Well, look there, one of them called. Boone finally found himself a housekeeper, and an old one at that. Another chimed in, mail-order brides these days must be cheaper than mules. The laughter rang sharp and cruel, slicing through Clara's ribs. Her cheeks burned, but she kept walking, each step heavy as lead. For years she had endured ridicule, her size, her age, her lack of worth as others measured it. But today something inside her cracked. She stopped in the middle of the street, set the basket down, and turned. Her voice, though trembling, carried across the muddy road. "I am not cheap," she said, her eyes locked on the men. "I am not less. I am a woman who has worked, who has lost, and who still stands. If that makes me laughable to you, so be it. But I will not shrink for your amusement." The saloon fell silent. Even the piano inside paused mid-note. The men, unprepared for her defiance, shifted awkwardly. One muttered something under his breath, but none of them laughed again. Thomas stepped forward then, not to shield her, but to stand beside her. His voice was calm but carried the weight of iron. "She's here because she chose to be. And I'll tell you this, a man who mocks a woman's strength ain't worth the dust on his boots." For the first time in years, Clara felt something unshackle inside her chest. She was not invisible. She was not voiceless. She had spoken and the world had listened, even if only for a moment. That night back at the ranch, Thomas placed a steaming mug of coffee in her hands. He didn't speak of the incident. He didn't need to. Instead, he said quietly, "I hope you know you don't have to prove yourself to anyone. Not to me, not to them." Clara looked at him, really looked. The scars on his hands, the lines etched deep by years of work and grief. He had known loneliness just as she had. But instead of letting it harden him, he had chosen gentleness. Her throat tightened. "I've been owned my whole life, Thomas. By family, by shame, by fear. But today," she paused, her eyes glistening. "Today I felt like I finally belonged to myself." He nodded, his gaze steady. "Then maybe that's the start of belonging here too." The words settled into her heart like seeds in freshly turned soil. For the first time, staying didn't feel like surrender. It felt like choosing. Clara had begun to reclaim her voice, her dignity, her sense of self. But could that newfound strength withstand the shadows of her past when they came knocking once more? The freedom Clara had begun to taste was fragile, like a thin sheet of glass beneath her feet. One letter, one reminder of the life she thought she had escaped, was all it took to crack it. It came folded in rough paper, delivered by a writer from her hometown. Thomas found it tucked between the flour sacks when he returned from the mercantile. He held it out silently, his brow furrowed. Clara's hands trembled as she unfolded the letter. The handwriting was her brother's, sharp and unforgiving, every stroke like a lash across her skin. "Clara, you belong to this family whether you admit it or not. We sent you west because there was no place left for you here. You were meant to ease our burden, not shame us further. If you think living with some rancher makes you more than what you are, remember you are nothing without us. Come home. Do not disgrace us further." Her chest constricted as the words bled into her bones. The old chains clamped down again. Shame duty, the crushing belief that she was nothing more than a transaction. Thomas watched her face pale, his voice low. "Clara, what does it say?" She shook her head quickly, clutching the paper to her chest. "It doesn't matter. It's just old wounds." But that night, lying in the quiet of her small room, the letter whispered louder than the crickets outside. "You are nothing. You are nothing." The past clawed at her ribs, threatening to undo every inch of strength she had reclaimed. The next morning, Thomas found her already dressed, a satchel by the door. "I should leave," she said softly, her eyes downcast. "They're right. I don't belong here. I never did." His voice broke the silence like a steady hammer. "Clara, look at me." Reluctantly, she lifted her gaze. He stepped closer, his weathered face lined not with anger, but with resolve. "I told you before, I'm not here to own you. But don't let them own you either. If you walk away now, you're not choosing freedom. You're handing it back to the ones who caged you." Her throat tightened. Tears pricked her eyes. "But what if they're right, Thomas? What if I am nothing more than what they said?" He shook his head slowly. "Then why do I see someone strong enough to stand in the street and silence cowards? Why do I see a woman who keeps this house alive with warmth, who carries dignity in her hands even after all they tried to take from her?" Clara, you're more than what they called you. You always were. His words struck deep, but the war inside her raged on. Part of her longed to believe him, to lay down the weight she had carried for decades. Another part feared that trusting his voice would only make her fall harder when he too decided she wasn't enough. That night she sat by the fire alone, the letter burning in her lap. She watched the flames lick the edges, curling the words into ash. And yet the question still lingered, heavy and sharp. Could she truly free herself from the past, or would it always come back to claim her? The ashes of the letter scattered, but the scars it left inside, Clara still burned. Would she ever believe Thomas's quiet truth over the family's cruel lie? The next morning, the prairie air carried a stillness after the storm. Clara rose early, her hands restless, her heart worn from nights of doubt. She stepped outside the letter's ashes, still faintly scattered on the ground near the fire pit. For years, she had lived with words branding her as worthless as shame, as burden. But now, watching those ashes drift into the soil, she felt a quiet truth stirring. Maybe she did not have to carry their voice anymore. Thomas was already in the yard mending the corral fence. His movements were steady, rhythmic, his silence never heavy, but grounding. She watched him for a moment, this man who had never demanded, never mocked, never tried to shape her into something she was not. And slowly something inside her loosened. Thomas, she called, her voice carrying across the early morning hush. He straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers, and came toward her. Yes, her breath caught, but she steadied it. I've been afraid all my life. Afraid of being too much or not enough. Afraid of staying, afraid of leaving. But yesterday, when I burned that letter, she swallowed hard. It felt like I was burning the last chain they ever had on me. Thomas's eyes softened, the kind of softness that came not from pity, but from respect. That's because it was never theirs to hold, Clara. You've always been yours. Her tears slipped freely now, but for once they were not born of shame, they were cleansing. Do you mean it? That I am more than what they said? He stepped closer, his hand rough and scarred from years of work, but gentle as it brushed against hers. Clara, I don't just mean it, I see it. Every day, you are more than enough. And if you'll allow me, I'd like to spend the rest of my days proving it to you. Her breath shuddered, breaking into something she hadn't felt in years. Relief, tenderness, hope. For the first time she believed he wasn't speaking out of obligation, but out of truth. The wind picked up across the grassland, carrying the scent of cedar and earth, and she felt herself standing taller, as if the land itself had accepted her belonging. She looked into his eyes, steady and true, and whispered, "Then let's live free, not as owner and own, but as two souls who chose each other." Thomas nodded, his voice low. "That's all I've ever wanted." And there in the morning light, something shifted, not just in her heart, but in the very fabric of her life. She was no longer the woman sent away as burden, nor the bride traded like cattle. She was a woman who had chosen and been chosen in return. Clara had finally loosened the chains of her past, daring to step into love freely. But could this newfound freedom carry them both into a future, built not on fear, but on hope? Spring crept gently across the plains, bringing with it new grass, soft rains, and the kind of light that made even the weathered boards of Thomas's ranch glow warm. In that light, Clara found herself different, not transformed into someone new, but restored into who she had always been before shame had buried her. She walked through the house no longer as a guest or a burden, but as if each room had opened its arms to her. The kitchen held the scent of her bread baking, the parlor echoed with her quiet humming. She belonged not because Thomas gave her permission, but because she finally allowed herself to. One Sunday she stepped out onto the porch, her hair unpinned and loose in the breeze. The scars left by years of ridicule hadn't vanished, but they no longer defined her. Instead, she carried them like old trails across the prairie, proof of where she had walked and how far she had come. Thomas joined her, 2 mugs of coffee in his hands. He handed her one, their fingers brushing. "Morning looks better with you in it," he said simply. She smiled, not shrinking from the words, but holding them close. "And I look better standing in it thanks to you." They sat together watching the land wake. Birds lifted into the sky, cattle grazed in the distance, And for the first time in decades, Clara felt no urge to look over her shoulder for the voices of her family. Their judgment no longer owned her. Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small token, a silver button he had kept from his late wife's sewing kit. Weathered plain but polished smooth by his thumb over the years. He placed it in Clara's hand. "I don't have rings, not yet," he said softly. "But I'd like this to be a promise, not of ownership, but of choosing. Every day if you'll let me." Tears blurred her sight as she closed her fingers over the button. She nodded, her voice steady. "Then we'll choose each other. Every day." The sun broke free from the horizon, spilling light across them both. In that glow, Clara realized that the story she carried would no longer be written by those who shamed her, but by the love she and Thomas had quietly, steadfastly built. She was not just a mail-order bride, not just a woman sent away to ease a family's burden. She was Clara, a woman who had survived, who had reclaimed her dignity, and who had finally found a home where love was not possession, but presence. From shame to belonging, Clara's journey had finally reached its quiet bloom. But every spring carries seeds for the future, what new chapters might unfold for Clara and Thomas beneath these wide western skies. In the final days of this story, we see Clara, a woman who was once considered a burden, finally find a place to belong. Not where she was forced, not where she had to kneel to be accepted, but beside Thomas, the man who said one sentence enough to change his whole life. "I'm not here to own you." Those are not just words of a rancher to a mail-order bride. They are words of respect, of a love that knows how to keep the freedom of the person it loves. And it is also a lesson for all of us sometimes. The greatest thing you can give to another person is not possession, but presence, the affirmation that they are enough as they are. If you have ever experienced hurt, been ignored, or thought you had no chance of being loved, remember Clara's story. True love is never too late. It may come quietly like the morning sun in the west, but when it does, it will warm the heart that has endured for too long. If this story touches you, please subscribe to the channel None. Wild West Saga, share it so that more people can hear it, and leave a comment. Would you like to see a sequel or similar healing stories? We read every word you write, and who knows, your story may be worth telling too.